I'm Peter Klein, and I want to talk to you about empirical research in the theory of the firm. As I mentioned in another lecture, the research literature on the economic theory of the firm, or the economic theory of organizations, has really exploded in the last several decades. But what is not as well known is that there is a growing empirical literature to go along with that theoretical body of work. Oliver Williamson famously argued that transaction cost economics can be understood as an empirical success story, meaning that the data strongly line up with the predictions of the transaction cost approach to the theory of the firm. However, some other critics have not been so strongly convinced and have worried that the ratio of theory to evidence in the literature on the firm is too high. So now I wish to summarize some of the empirical work that's been done to date and suggest some of its advantages and weaknesses and inspire some of you to do additional empirical research in this area. Now, the theory of the firm deals with questions such as what are the boundaries of the firm and how should the firm be organized internally. There's quite a large empirical literature on boundaries, the first of those questions. Much of it is in the tradition of transaction cost economics, as elaborated by Williamson and his colleagues, and it mostly corroborates the accounts that are provided by Williamson and transaction cost economics, though there are some outstanding issues and problems. However, there are not as many papers distinguishing between different versions of the economic theory of the firm. For example, Williamson's transaction cost approach and the property rights approach of Oliver Hart and his colleagues. Even though these theories in many ways offer slightly different predictions on economic organization, most of the empirical literature has not been sufficiently careful to distinguish among them. As for internal organization, there are many studies in management and labor economics showing, for example, that aligning incentives within an organization improves the performance of the firm. But there is much less work on other aspects of organizational form, such as the structure of the hierarchy, which leads to the best results. Now, probably the first topic to be studied extensively within the theory of the firm is the question of vertical boundaries, what Williamson called the paradigm problem of the economic theory of the firm. And so there have been many studies of component procurement, marketing and distribution, the organization of labor, asking essentially whether firms should make their own inputs or buy inputs on the open market. There are other papers that deal with the details of the contracts that are used to coordinate vertical activities. For example, when are contracts an appropriate substitute for vertical integration? When firms do use long-term contracts to procure their inputs or to distribute their outputs, how do they design those contracts? Are they long or short, simple or complex? Are particular provisions excluded or not? And we have some evidence on contracts and contractual design, but the evidence is less conclusive in that area. So just to give you a few examples, some of the earliest studies, the earliest econometric studies, argued that the likelihood of observing a particular organizing arrangement, for example, vertical integration compared to outsourcing, can be explained in terms of attributes of the underlying transaction. The degree of asset specificity, the level of uncertainty, or the frequency of trade. And if we have data on organizational practices within a firm, how many components are procured externally versus produced internally, or within an industry, how many firms are vertically integrated, how many use outsourcing, we can construct some variables that measure organizational form. And we can then use that as the dependent variable in some regressions in which we include characteristics of transactions as the explanatory variables. There are a number of qualitative and quantitative studies and some multi-industry studies, most of which seem consistent with the basic idea that more difficult, complex transactions transactions involving greater levels of asset specificity are more likely to be tightly vertically coordinated through vertical integration or long-term contracts. Now, there's a problem in most of these studies, which I'll elaborate on in just a moment, namely that we assume that the observations in our sample are organized efficiently or appropriately. It's a little bit more difficult to interpret the evidence if we think that some of the observations in our sample may represent error or mistakes. In terms of contracts or the use of contracts versus vertical integration, there's less on this topic, even though one of the canonical examples used in the theory of the firm, the acquisition of Fisher Body by General Motors in the 1920s, is really a story about the trade-offs between a contract and vertical integration, because GM and Fisher already had a long-term contract before GM decided to acquire the assets of Fisher Body. Now, Benjamin Klein and his colleagues and Williamson had famously argued that vertical integration was a way of solving the holdup problem associated with relationship-specific investment. But some other authors, including Ronald Coase, have argued that a different explanation is needed, and that perhaps the difference between a contract and vertical integration as means of securing relationship-specific capital has more to do with knowledge and relationships among the key managerial staff. So there may be a knowledge-sharing story that is just as important as the holdup story that we're more familiar with. There are a number of studies of the duration of contracts and the complexity of contracts that are used to procure inputs and to distribute outputs. And where we have data on procurement contracts, their length, their complexity, the specific terms that are included or not, we can do empirical studies where the dependent variable, the phenomenon to be explained, is some attribute of the contract. By the way, we have a number of studies of franchising as a unique kind of hybrid organizational form, where we try to explain when industries are organized or firms are organized as franchise networks rather than networks of company-owned stores. One of the reasons there's so much research on franchising is because the data are generally made public, because franchisors, in an attempt to attract franchisees, must disclose the details of the franchise contract. And we know, for example, that firms are more likely to use company-owned stores rather than franchised outlets when the level of asset specificity is particularly high. As I mentioned, there are some methodological issues associated with the empirical research in the theory of the firm. First, many of the key variables, such as asset specificity, are difficult to define and measure consistently. Second, we don't know as much about the costs of internal governance, the administrative costs of bringing transactions inside, as we know about the costs of external transactions. In other words, the holdup problem and other issues that arise when we procure on the market. Third, there's a fundamental methodological problem that when we observe a sample of firms that are organized in one way or another, and we try to explain the choice of organizational form in terms of some underlying characteristics, we don't know if we are observing a set of firms, all of which are optimally organized, in which case we can explain the relationship between these attributes and organizational form, or if we're looking at a sample of firms that includes errors, firms that are vertically integrated when they really shouldn't be, but are. In that case, we need some way of evaluating the relationship between the fit among organizational form and attributes and the performance of the firm, measured by profit or survival or some other measure. So more recently, scholars have turned towards multistage models, where in the first stage, they use some theory to predict the alignment between the characteristics of the transaction and the organizational form that is chosen. And then in a second or third stage, try to explain the relationship between alignment and the performance of the firm. That way we know if we are testing whether the predictions of the theory are correct or testing whether entrepreneurs are taking the correct actions as proposed by the theory. So to summarize, empirical work in the broad sense of empirical is critical to the development of new and existing theories of the firm. This includes not only econometric studies, but also case studies, interviews, and other kinds of qualitative analysis. This work can be difficult, but it is extremely rewarding in helping us to understand better the differences among theories and the circumstances under which particular theories apply, and helping us to understand what we see around us.